Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Snow Day Redux. Public schools in Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley are closed again due to the weather. What does this mean for your household? And main roads are cleared, but those side streets are still dicey. How hard is it for people with mobility issues? In our second half hour, yet another shakeup at the Ministry of Children and Family Development. Why does this ministry seem impossible to manage? I'm Michelle Eliot. Welcome to BC Today. Thank you for joining us on CBC Radio 1 and live streaming on the CBC News app, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. Those snowy, icy, and slushy sidewalks are causing trouble for pedestrians around BC, but for people with mobility challenges, including wheelchairs, walkers, and even strollers, that access is crucially important. And now the onus for clearing sidewalks is on property owners and occupants of residences and businesses. Fines for not clearing a sidewalk by 10 a.m. after it has snowed range from $100 in Langford to between $200 and $750 in Vancouver. Bylaw officers are out documenting infractions in Vancouver. And side streets, though, are an entirely different matter. The City of Vancouver told us side streets are not part of the city's winter maintenance plan unless they are on priority hills or provide access to hospitals, schools, and care facilities. And adding side streets to our plan would require a significant investment to adequately resource and would require significant changes to on-street parking regulation on residential streets. Well, we would like to hear from you. Are you being impacted by icy, snowy sidewalks today? What about access to side streets? And what are some solutions to keeping pedestrian access clear after a snowfall? You can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca. And here to tell us more is Tanel Bolt. Hi, Tanel. Good afternoon.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. You're joining us from Langford. Tell us what it's like there.
I am a full-time wheelchair user and the proud owner of a new service dog in training that has been extremely confined by the snow. I know of nobody in Langford who has been fined for not shoveling.
Okay, so you're saying enforcement is an issue. You are a wheelchair user and a design consultant and accessibility consultant. Tell us, can you paint us a picture in general? What is it like for people with mobility challenges when there is a significant snowfall?
So I live within sight of the downtown core of Langford, where I witness all day, every day, people with strollers and mobility aids that use this main thoroughfare to get to town and all of the businesses and resources that provides. And when it snows, everybody disappears. I left the house yesterday to go down the street and across one road to the park to take the dog out. And I was forced to push myself through snow and slush. And usually the biggest barrier is where the snow plows on the street push the big mound of snow into the curb cut and leave it there for somebody else to contend with. The plow operator actually saw me pushing down the sidewalk with the dog, stopped the plow and asked if he could push me across the street, which in my mind was if he was going to push me further away from where I had come from and leave me there. I am in worse condition than if I just get stuck and have to turn around and come home.
Oh my gosh, I'm just imagining this all playing out. What was that like for you? First of all, the fact that snow had basically been plowed into and pushed onto that curb cut, which is relied on by people who are rolling. And so, how often do you see that? And what does that mean? What does that say to you?
I see it every single time it snows. I am originally from the prairies and lived a long time in the Kootenays, where access for people with mobility challenges is not considered. Even the gentleman that so graciously got out of his truck and offered to push me through, I specifically noted to him that the curb cuts and this pile of snow that he pushes in the way are the biggest barrier. And he did nothing about it. He got back in the truck, not understanding my concern or the barrier that he left in the way, and continued to plow. So when I came back from the park, I had two big mounds of snow and slush to get through at the curb cuts after specifically stating more than once in various ways of why that was important. And it's not understood.
It's not understood. We'd like to hear from our audience on this as well. Is this something that you've encountered? Are you having trouble, traversing, getting around those sidewalks and side streets today? Love to hear from you. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. And you can also hit pound 690 on your cell phone and email us bctoday@cbc.ca. My guest is Tanel Bolt, a design and accessibility consultant, joining me from Langford. And Tanel, what then is the solution here? Is it about enforcing those fines, ensuring people do clear the sidewalks in front of their homes and in apartment buildings, or is it about plowing the streets properly?
All of the above. If one is done and the others are not, it still doesn't benefit access, because you can get down the sidewalk and encounter the barrier in the street, or you get to the street and coming up on the sidewalk on the other side, you're encountering the same barrier. Promoting education behind this, perhaps the council getting in a wheelchair and actually experiencing what a snowfall is like. I know last year when the snow fell in Langford, the worst spot was in front of City Hall, where they decided that one shovel width was enough on the sidewalk to get through 2 feet of snow, which my chair is narrow and I scraped both sides of the snow on either side. Staff education, public works education, talking about it like this on the news, showing pictures of people struggling, and then actually being accountable when I do call bylaw, not having the person on the other end that was the director of engineering and public works tell me that I should consider myself lucky that we even have one plow, because 5 years ago we had no plows.
So it sounds like the communication you have had with city officials hasn't been productive.
I haven't even reached out this year because I don't have the energy anymore to fight people that don't understand and don't care to learn.
What responsibility does the city have to be the ones to reach out and learn about what the challenges are for people in Langford with mobility challenges?
It's being mandated by the BC provincial government with our Accessible BC Act. And so it is becoming a law that they need to be educated on this and they need to be accountable to this. Unfortunately, our Human Rights Tribunal is so swamped that I don't even know if these situations make it that far. There's nowhere we can go to hold our municipal bodies accountable to the lack and the discrimination that occurs every time it snows.
We have not been able to reach out to the city of Langford on your particular comments. We did hear from the city of Vancouver saying, side streets are not part of their winter maintenance plan. And if they were to add it to that plan, it would require a significant investment and changes to on-street parking regulations. So if they were to plow residential streets, that would include plowing into parking spots on those narrow streets. What do you think should be the approach, or should those winter plans be changed then?
I think Vancouver talked around the subject because I have been downtown Vancouver, not on a side street, where snow removal was awful. And I had to get individuals to push me around. Um, the police cars were wearing chains on their tires, and I had a meeting downtown where the snow removal was insufficient on main streets downtown. So the fact that they're talking about side streets is besides the point. Also, everywhere else in Canada seems to have this figured out. So this is not an excuse. Vancouver, talk to Calgary, talk to Edmonton. They also don't do it great or right. So potentially with the accessibility legislation and things that have come through the Accessible Canada Act, maybe this is a federal education push so that we are included. Our statistics just came out. There are 27% of Canadians that identify with disability as of 2023. That's a lot.
We had a caller yesterday who was delivering medication for a local pharmacy, and we talked about how difficult it was, as a driver to get the medications to people who needed them with chronic conditions. What is the impact on someone when they aren't able to get out of the house?
Well, everybody had that impact with COVID, right? We know the impact mentally and physically and emotionally when you can't get to, say, a medical appointment that you've waited 6 months for. You can't get to, well, pharmacies are nice and they do deliver, but exercise is key. Physical movement is very important to your overall well-being, and having a social network and the ability to go and be social and enjoy the outdoors. There's so much beautiful stuff outside to experience in the snow, and the peace and quiet, right? In Vancouver, if you're living downtown, you don't get peace and quiet. It is nice to be able to go out in the snow when a lot of that sensory overload is muted a little bit with it.
Gets nice and quiet after a snowfall, doesn't it? And I know you're a para-athlete as well, so you speak from experience there. Thank you very much for your time, Tanel. Thanks for joining us on this issue.
Thanks, Michelle.
That is Tanel Bolt, who is a design and accessibility consultant. She joined us from Langford. It's 12:18 now, 1:18 in the Mountain Time Zone. You're with BC Today. Well, who is at fault if you slip on an uncleared sidewalk? The CBC's Jason Proctor explains.
You're a homeowner, it's snowing outside, the sidewalk is building with snow, and you're wondering, what should I do? You're required by the law to clear the sidewalks in front of you because of city bylaws, but what happens if somebody slips on the sidewalk because, well, either you don't clear it or you kind of do a shoddy job of it? The issue of sidewalks and slipping on sidewalks and homeowner liability was actually considered by the BC Court of Appeal a few years ago in a case that involved a man in Burnaby who was walking with a carton of eggs in front of a house where he slipped on the ice, and he ended up suing the homeowners because he claimed that the shoddy job that they had done of maintaining the sidewalk in front of their home had turned it into black ice, making it a liability and ultimately causing his injury. The appeal court judges, in looking at this, looked at the collective responsibility we all take on for the cities by agreeing to shovel our sidewalks, essentially doing their job for them. The judges found that if you found people responsible for any injury that happens because they're doing the job, they're doing their civic duty essentially, that would be turning it into a situation where essentially nobody would end up shoveling their sidewalk. So bottom line, you can't be held responsible if somebody slips on the sidewalk in front of your house because, you didn't shovel the right way. And if you are walking on the sidewalk in front of anybody's house in this kind of weather, be careful. Jason Proctor, CBC News, Vancouver.
We have an email from Bob on the snow clearing, and Bob writes, the recent snowfall shows the bylaws about sidewalk clearing need to be enforced. The thought of a fine is of no value if there is no enforcement. We also need to look at how we clear the roads. We don't physically remove the snow, we just move it around from the center of the road to the side of the road. Your guest's observations are spot on about the issues of getting around when sidewalks and curb cutouts are not properly cleared. I do appreciate her candor. It is refreshing. Bob, thank you very much for your email. It's 12:21 now, 1:21 in the Mountain Time Zone. Meanwhile, all public schools in Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley are closed for a second day. What does this mean to you? Were your kids doing a happy dance this morning like mine? Or does this complicate your day when it comes to work or childcare? What about if you're a teacher or a staff member? What does it mean for you? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can also hit pound 690 on your cell phone. By email, it's bctoday@cbc.ca. Ratinder Matthews speaks for the Surrey School District and joins us now. Hello, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon.
I see you're working from home, as most people probably are. At what point did the district decide to keep schools closed for a second day?
So the decision was made really early this morning at around just close to 6:30. We typically, what we tell our families is a decision will be posted by 7 a.m. at the very latest, but we try to post as soon as we can make a decision. So that typically involves our superintendent and deputy superintendent driving routes throughout the district through Surrey and White Rock to see what road conditions are like. Our facilities team are out at sites, clearing them, clearing out parking lots, walkways, salting entrances. And so they report back in on conditions as well. And then we work with authorities to determine what the conditions overall are like. And all of that determines whether our schools are open or closed.
So they were out and about this morning and assessing things. Okay.
Very early this morning.
Wow.
Yeah.
And when you posted the announcement on X this morning, formerly known as Twitter, there were many comments saying, thank you, this was a good decision. Some comments, though, not understanding why, given the main roads are clear and it wasn't snowing, certainly not the same way it was yesterday. So what was it about the conditions today that made it difficult?
So I think a lot of the main routes were clear. It's a lot of the streets that our schools are on. So we knew that staff and families would be driving on those routes, would be walking on those routes. In some cases, sidewalks weren't fully clear. So there's a number of factors that are considered, as well as the weather that we're expecting throughout the course of the day as well.
Okay. And so for parents who may be scratching their heads saying, wow, a second day, I don't know when the last time I experienced a second snow day was, and perhaps wondering what justifies that, what would you say to them?
So, I think safety is at the heart of everything that we're doing. And so, we've got a pretty comprehensive protocol, and we work closely with other authorities in the area as well. And a weather service, we monitor it closely. And so it was a pretty comprehensive decision. It's not an easy decision. Our district, we'd prefer to keep our schools open, but we also recognize that safety is the key here. We have staff that travel to school sites. We want to ensure their safety. We have students that walk to school, drive to school. So we need to ensure everyone's safety, and that's how we would determine our decisions. There's also a call that our superintendent participates in with other superintendents around the area as well, where they all check in to see what conditions are like in other areas as well.
What impact does this have on other programs related to the school? Things perhaps like student supports and meal programs. What impact does that have on those supports that are provided to students?
So those are really critical, and that's something, when we determine whether a school is open or closed, we do want it to be open where we can, because we know there's a lot of really vulnerable students that rely on our schools to stay open for meal programs, for other supports as well, right? There's so many supports that our schools provide to students and families. And so that is key. And in some cases, staff are checking in with students to see how they're doing and what other supports they need. But yeah, that is at the heart of our decision making as well, to ensure that our students are taken care of and that we are able to continue providing supports.
And what about schools perhaps that may have childcare facilities related to them, or simply parents who rely on being able to send their kids to school if they aren't able to work from home?
It's a challenge, right? Our schools are closed, and our staff are on site making sure that they're safe. So our facilities team is out shoveling and clearing parking lots, ensure that they're safe. But the decision to close was made because was made due to safety, and so that's the critical piece. That's why we aren't able to keep the schools open, and we recognize that there are impacts to our community, and especially with childcare. I think a lot of us were struggling whenever schools are closed on around that area, and so it is a challenge, and we recognize that.
And what about for the curriculum, Ratinder? Are there any issues there, like setting things back perhaps administratively or delaying tests? I know some may be on the semester system that is soon wrapping up.
And that's another consideration. It's and again, like, this isn't an easy decision, and there's so many factors that we have to consider. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have to close schools, right? So these are all things that we consider, but safety is at the heart of the decisions when it's due to inclement weather. And so we need to make sure our community is safe whether we decide to open or close schools. And the impacts around curriculum, staff will, it is a challenge, and we recognize it's a challenge, and staff will find ways to make up that time.
Right. What is the guidance for teachers on that front?
So teachers, to plan accordingly and to see how we can adjust schedules, like our classroom curriculum. So these are conversations that'll probably be happening in our schools, and they'll be talking to their principals and the district around ways that they can make this work. And, continuity of instruction is critical, and our student well-being and their education is also critical. So those are at the heart of all of these decisions, and all the decisions moving forward to make up that time as well.
I do wonder if there has been a change perhaps in decision making. I'm just thinking back to last 2023, or rather end of 2022, I guess, the snowmageddon that took place, and how long it took people to commute. It hit right during the afternoon commute, and people took hours and hours to get home. Do those kinds of events, have they perhaps influenced school districts? And I noticed that the streets are quiet. People have decided to stay home. Do you see perhaps a shift in how people are approaching a snow event, and perhaps lowering the bar, or thinking we're not going to push things?
I can speak to our district's protocols. We do have a protocol in place on how a snow day is called, and those are the steps that we follow to ensure the safety of our community. So checking roads, sidewalks, school and parking lot conditions, if there's any power outages or other emergent issues that we need to consider. And, like I mentioned, our superintendent and deputy superintendent are out very early in the morning to assess conditions, see what those are like. Our facilities staff are reporting back to say what those conditions are like. So there's a number of factors that we consider in our decision making. It's difficult to say that that's shifted. I think we have a protocol in place that we follow before a decision is made, and those are all the factors that are considered here in our district.
And were there any lessons from the pandemic in terms of schools adapting or making that switch, or making those kinds of decisions?
Around closures?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so this is a weather-related closure, right? So we actually, the protocol around that is based on conditions and around safety, to environmental conditions. So it's a little bit unique in that respect. And the protocols, they do change as we gain more knowledge on weather conditions, and we start collaborating with more partner agencies as well. So, it does evolve in that respect. But this is more based on environmental conditions. Okay,
so no connection there. What should people expect tomorrow? How will things roll out tomorrow?
So for tomorrow, our crews are out. Our facilities team and school admin and support staff are all out clearing sites, ensuring that they're safe. We're hopeful that we can open tomorrow. Again, like we talked earlier, we recognize that there's so many families, some of our more vulnerable students, that really rely on our schools. And so we're really hopeful that we can start again tomorrow. But we tell families, just check our website, all our social media channels. We'll have a decision posted by 7 a.m. at the very latest, but we'll aim to get that up earlier if we can.
Really good to have you on explaining the decision making and taking us through this process. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Ratinder Matthews speaks for Surrey Schools. It's 12:30 now, 1:30 in the Mountain Time Zone. You're with BC Today here on CBC. I'm Michelle Eliot. Very nice to have you with us this afternoon. And coming up in our next half hour, we're going to discuss the Ministry of Children and Family Development. Another shake-up there with the resignation of the Minister Mitzi Dean will be replaced by Grace Lohr. We're asking you, what do you think needs to be fixed at that ministry, given the many, many challenges it has faced over the years? We'll hear from Mary Teegee from the Carrier-Sakani Family Services coming up after this CBC News update. And here now is Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. Transit buses and sea buses here in the Lower Mainland could come to a halt for 2 days next week as transit supervisors threaten to expand job action. About 180 supervisors, engineers, maintenance and communication workers began an overtime ban earlier this month. After talks broke down, the union says without a deal, all services will be withdrawn next Monday for 48 hours. Police say a man who crashed through a concrete barrier on the second level of a parkade at UBC yesterday has died. His vehicle fell to the ground and was resting on its front end. First responders couldn't immediately free him from the vehicle because part of the concrete barrier was still hanging precariously above the wrecked sedan. The circumstances that led to the crash are still under investigation. And Environment Canada says more snow is expected this afternoon in Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria and the Fraser Valley. A snowfall warning is in place for Victoria with up to 10 centimeters expected there. And taking a look at the rest of the forecast on the north coast, cloudy and windy this afternoon with a high of +1. Highs around -20 and cloudy in the Peace. In the central interior, mainly sunny with a high of -15. Highs to -7 with a mix of sun and cloud in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, a bit of sunshine with highs to -11. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria and the Fraser Valley, the snow should start sometime this hour. There's a risk of freezing rain later this afternoon, but it is expected to warm up tomorrow with the snow turning to rain in most areas. And that's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
Did a little shoveling myself yesterday. My husband did, and then I did some more this morning because I got stuck trying to
Your car got stuck?
I sure did, yes. How was your walk?
My walk was fine. I also shoveled quite a bit. I did it early yesterday morning.
Yes.
And then had to do it like 2 hours later. And then when I got home from work, there was a lot there. So it was a busy shoveling
and
day.
I could have sworn I got to that earlier today.
That's right. Where were my neighbors all day? Come on.
Wow, doing some neighbor shaming.
Sure.
My neighbor was shoveling as well. I could hear the grunting as I was going in the house. We actually have an email from Susan who writes, yesterday on my lunch break while working from home, I started shoveling the sidewalk. I was so focused on my task, I didn't notice the snow plow coming, and I ended up covered by a big spray of snow, and then the plow shoved a whole bunch of snow onto the sidewalk I had just shoveled. Oh no, leaving more snow on it.
Dangerous business, that shoveling.
It sure is. That said, I'm thankful for everyone's efforts to keep roads safe. So thanks to you, Rob. Maybe not so much your neighbors.
No, my neighbors, I want to clarify. My neighbors cleared their sidewalk. I was saying they should have been clearing mine while I was at work.
Well, okay.
That's what I was getting at.
Sure.
My neighbors are fantastic.
Yeah.
I want to clarify that, Michelle.
There you go. Wow. That's a good neighbor. Demanding neighbor, but a good neighbor.
Sure.
Okay. Rob, thank you very much.
You bet.
Rob Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom who wants to clarify he loves his neighbors. Well, recently, Mitzi Dean was replaced as BC's Minister of Children and Family Development. There had been growing calls for Dean to resign following the ministry's handling of several child welfare cases, and that includes a horrific case of abuse that resulted in the death of one Indigenous child in care. Dean will take on the Ministry of Childcare, and Grace Lohr will replace her at MCFD. And calls for Dean's resignation came from the BC United Party, the BC Green Party, and the First Nations Leadership Council. Premier David Eby was asked if the cabinet shuffle was a result of those demands. He said no.
But we came reluctantly to a shared decision that in order to keep moving forward, to accelerate this work, we need to have a reset at the ministry. And I'm very grateful to Mitzi for taking on the important work of childcare. This is an area that is so important to so many families across the province, that they have access to high quality, affordable childcare. And I'm also very grateful to Minister Lohr. Obviously, MCFD is not an easy file. It is probably, if not one of the most, certainly one of the most challenging, if not the most challenging file, because of what's at stake, kids' safety. And so I am glad that she's taking it on. It's going to be a big challenge, but I know she's up for it.
That's Premier David Eby speaking to reporters this week. In a few minutes, we'll take your calls. What do you think of the replacement, the resignation of Mitzi Dean as Minister of Children and Family Development? What do you think is needed to fix this ministry? As you heard from the Premier there, it is perhaps the most difficult ministry in the cabinet. And let us know what your thoughts are on what needs to be done to ensure that it does its job and those issues are addressed. You can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can also email us, bctoday@cbc.ca. Before we get to your calls, I'm joined first by Mary Teegee, Chair of the Indigenous Child and Family Services Directors Forum. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
What's your reaction to the resignation of Mitzi Dean as Minister of Children and Family Development?
Well, first of all, it's good news for us. I just really want to congratulate Minister Lohr and Deputy Minister Galbraith for their appointments, and we're very encouraged by the Premier's reference to that. This change in leadership is a reset for the child welfare system in British Columbia. In 2017, the federal minister herself had actually said that the child welfare system has created a humanitarian crisis among Indigenous people throughout the country. So it's very welcome news that, if you keep doing the same things, you're going to get the same results. So hopefully this change in leadership will lead to real proactive, effective change for our children and families.
As you might have heard the Premier say there, this is such a difficult ministry. It's faced hurdle after hurdle. There have been scathing report after scathing report. How much of a difference will a change in leadership make?
Well, they have to make substantive changes, across the board, not only in leadership, but they have to really look at their policies, the funding piece. There's been many recommendations from Indigenous groups. I'm the chair of the Indigenous Child and Family Service Directors Forum. We've provided many recommendations over the year. We've advocated for, increased substantive equality and funding, changes to the way the process and the policies. And so it really has to be a collaborative effort where they're actually taking to heed the ones that are actually doing the work on the ground and really implementing those changes in a timely manner. There's also, not to forget, is that the representative for children and youth over the years has made many recommendations for reform, but there's only a few of those recommendations that have been acted on.
Why is that? What kind of oversight is needed so that those recommendations, and we'll go through some of them with you while we have you, but what oversight is needed to ensure that those recommendations from the First Nations Leadership Council, from the representative of children and youth, are in fact being met or even being worked on?
Well, I think they got to look at a whole new way. There is the move for the Indigenous director. And that's an amendment to the existing CFCSA. And so if you look at that Indigenous director, where they need to have more teeth and they have to have, the ability to make decisions and actually need to have a budget and a staffing. It can't just be a title and say, okay, we have an Indigenous director, but they're going to have no budget, and perhaps it shouldn't rest with the Ministry of Children and Families, because we know that system has been unwieldy and you can't change it I know people that have tried to change it from within. So perhaps a new way of looking, a new approach. Maybe the Indigenous Director for Child and Families ought to sit under the DRIPA, like the Secretariat for the Declarations and Rights of Indigenous People. Perhaps we need to look at how the whole system has to change, and maybe this issue would be better solved, like all the complaints, all of the real difficult times we've had. Like, we were seeing, the children dying in care, all of these horrific things. Like, we just have to get out of the box and look at a new way of doing things.
What's your biggest frustration?
I would say, like, probably my biggest frustration, we provide service at Carriers County Family Services for 11 First Nations. There's a real frustration where even for funding, so off-reserve children, that there's not the same equitable funding as, say, on-reserve children. And there's a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, of course, the big settlement that we just had. Well, the provincial government is in the same situation, where we're going to have to go to human rights. There's, class action, all of this stuff, because of that inequity, because there isn't enough funding to provide prevention off reserve to the vulnerable families. And so I think there needs to be, I would hope, I'm really willing to work with the new minister, just basically to implement the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders that were set out when we won the case against Canada for discrimination. Those same issues are the same issues we have in the province. So there is a roadmap of how to get to a good place where we have staffing, where we have the supports for vulnerable families. There is a way to go forward, and all the province needs to do is to truly implement Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders, but also not to forget that BC, all those years ago under Premier Campbell, was the first province to adopt Jordan's Principle. And so that needs to happen as well in the province of BC, so that all the children and families would get the service regardless of who the government of first contact is. And that's not happening in British Columbia either.
And you were talking about that federal case. This is the case that we know Cindy Blackstock was also involved in terms of the equity in care of children, whether on and off reserve. Can you remind our listeners about Jordan's Principle and what that meant?
So Jordan's Principle is basically Jordan River Anderson was a baby that was in hospital, and he couldn't move home because there was a fight between whether or not it was a federal, whether they would fund it federally or provincially. So at the end of the day, he was sort of left in this no man's land, and then ended up staying in the hospital and dying in the hospital without ever going to his home community, because neither government would take responsibility. And so Jordan's Principle is basically that child gets the service, and they can sort out who is going to fund it federally or provincially later, but that child gets the service as they need it and require it right away.
What would be, you mentioned wanting to have discussions with the new minister. What would be your first recommendation then?
I think my first recommendation would be that they actually adopt the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders. I think that's hugely important, because then, there is that to adopt that, there is substantive equality for Indigenous children. All of the Jordan's Principle, like that has to be adopted and enacted on. I think those are very quick things that they can do. I also think that, we do have a partnership table where the Indigenous directors meet with the different levels of the province ministries. And MCFD workers. So we have a partnership table to address these issues, but it's when we bring recommendations and they're unheard, I think that's what's really frustrating. And so how do we proactively work together to implement the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders off reserve? I think that's hugely important.
Okay. Pardon me, you've brought those issues forward and have not been listened to?
Yes. And so I think our only recourse is to take legal action. And that's where we're at. We have asked the Premier to set up a negotiations table so that we could start looking at a true, immediate reform, medium reform, and long-term reform. We're doing that at the national level, and we should be doing that here at the provincial level to actually make reform so no child has to ever suffer discrimination again.
And finally, Mary, the one big piece of news late last year was this vote by the Cowichan tribes, the largest First Nation in BC, to take authority over child and family services for its own members. what impact might that have? How significant is that? And you talked about the bureaucracy, different jurisdictions. What kind of impact might that have moving forward?
Well, I think that's like, all of us are working on that to take advantage of federal enabling legislation that allows us to develop our own laws. And that would be extremely important, but there has to be the resources, the provincial resources that go with that to enact that law. I've always said this, we've always had the inherent right to take care of our children, the jurisdiction to take care of our children. What we haven't had are the resources to breathe life into our own laws. So once we have our own laws, it's based on our principles, based on our ways of doing things, and based on really what's happening on the ground in our communities. Who best knows our communities but our people? So we just need to ensure that there are those wraparound supports for families, and doing it in a new way and looking at it through the child's eyes, but also to ensure that we have the resources to do that work.
Very good to hear from you today. Thank you so much. We'll continue to follow the story.
You bet. Take care.
Take care. Mary Teegee is chair of the Indigenous Child and Family Services Directors Forum. What do you think of what you've just heard? More changes coming to the Ministry of Children and Family Development with the resignation of Mitzi Dean, now replaced by Grace Lohr. What do you think needs to be fixed at the ministry? And you can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, and you can hit pound 690 on your cell phone as well. In a couple of minutes, we're going to hear from a former Minister of Children and Family Development under the Gordon Campbell Liberals early in the 2000s. But first, let's hear from Dean, who's joining us in Parksville. Hi, Dean. Good afternoon.
Hey, how are you doing?
I am okay. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are regarding women and children who experience tremendous physical and coercive violence from their partners, and the court systems having to play catch up in terms of being empowered to deal with these situations. Presently, part of the frustration that I've seen over 2 years advocating for a young family here on the island is that when they get to the court system, when you're talking about situations that are, they're in the court system for over a period of years, there are not judges seated to that particular case. There's a new judge every single time that they come in, and it makes it very difficult for the court system and for judges per se to actually make an effective decision that would protect those people. And I understand there are changes being made within the ministry and within the court system itself. And the ministry, I believe, needs to work closer with the court system. So some of the changes being made in Kelowna, I guess there's a court bench that is specifically applied directly to coercive and physical violence situations. And there's a handful of specifically trained judges who can then make decisions based on what they see, rather than a new judge every single time and not getting a full picture of things. So there's changes within that. And the human rights, your former caller also mentioned human rights with regard to First Nations and what's going on there, and totally agree. I would also say that human rights of young families in general are at question right now, or at risk because of courts playing catch up. And there's a lot of instances of people who are tending towards sociopathic or psychopathic tendencies because of all the stress right now. But making those changes in the court system, I think, are really important.
That's a really important point, and the way that the court system interacts. You're referring to perhaps family law as well. I know that that's part of what the Attorney General is looking at when it comes to consulting over what needs to be done with family law and the way that that court system interacts with the ministry. And as you say, the point I take from your call is the ministry needs to work with the court system. But you make the point that it is also an overloaded system at this time. Dean, thank you so much for your call. Really appreciate it. And let's go to our next guest now. And we're going to hear about what the challenges are from within the ministry. And Gordie Hogue is a former Minister of Children and Family Development under the Gordon Campbell Liberals from 2001 and 2004. And good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you, Michelle.
Can I ask what went through your mind when you heard about this change in leadership once again at the Ministry of Children and Family Development?
Well, I think the Premier laid it out quite well, saying that there are significant challenges and it may be the most difficult ministry in existence.
Mm.
However, I think that one of the things that I learned when I was the minister was that my wife and I had formerly been foster parents, and one of our foster children was Indigenous. I, at the time, was also a probation officer, and I became warden of our largest youth jail, and was anxious to be able to find more positive ways of integrating and understanding what was happening. So when I became the minister, I formed an advisory committee that had a number of Indigenous leaders on it, that representing First Nations, representing Métis, United Native Nations. We had Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, we had Grand Chief Ed John, and we met regularly in order to make steps forward in terms of having a more integrated and coordinated approach to things.
And what difference did that make, or has that made?
Well, it made a number of differences in the early going. We had, after a number of meetings, the deputy minister said, well, things are going well. Perhaps we should bring all of the leaders down to Vancouver and see if we can come to a full agreement. So I went to my good friend, Grand Chief Bernard Charles at the Semiahmoo, and I said, this is what's being proposed. What do you think? And he said, that's a silly idea. We should be having a feast. We should be coming to Semiahmoo. So the Semiahmoo people put on a feast, and we had all of the leaders there and a number of people from Victoria. We played something called Indian poker that I'd never heard of. We had a feast. We took a break, sat around a picnic table for about 15 minutes, came to an agreement, and then went back to playing Indian poker. And I think if we had done it our traditional Caucasian way, we would have never come to an agreement. But following and utilizing the traditions and practices of the Indigenous people, we learned a lot and were able to make a decision quickly and move forward with that.
It sounds, though, from our previous interview with Mary TG, that these issues that are being put forward by Indigenous leaders and communities are now currently not being listened to. And as you mentioned, the Premier said this is a very difficult ministry. Why does it continue to be so challenging?
Well, I think that the Indigenous people have a whole culture and thousands of years of understanding and decision-making and processes, and they make better decisions in many ways than I think our traditional British parliamentary system does. They look back 6 generations and say, what would just 6 generations in the past think about what we're doing today? And what would 6 generations from now think about what we're doing today? So they take a much broader, positive approach to things. And listening to your discussion with Mary reminded me that at one point I had a discussion with one of the regional directors for the Carrier-Sacani Nation for the Prince George area. And there had been a boy who was in court, and the probation officer wanted to know how I felt about being able to, instead of having the court recommend that he move down the road from their traditional territory, from the reserve, and that an elder would meet with him every day. And we did that. And this is a boy who had been charged with a fairly significant offenses. And that process worked extremely well with an elder going down and visiting every day and then bringing back. And that was a more traditional way of dealing with things. And I think one of the big challenges we have today is that we're not taking advantage of those opportunities that are there. And certainly, again, we have big challenges. There are 634 First Nations nationally and over 200 in BC. And when I last looked at it, about 60% of the youths in care were Indigenous, and yet they only represented 10% of the youth population in the province.
There is a
So they're very disparate and inappropriate response that we're doing there. And I also did some work with Carol James, and she had lived up in the Carrier-Sacani area, and she and I worked together, and she invited me to spend some time on the reserve that she was working on. And I spent a couple of nights there, and it was very helpful being able to listen and just spend time, not just in meetings, but in all kinds of other traditions of ways of understanding, and not our traditional rational agent model, but much more of a model of caring and commitment and eating together and celebrating together.
More collaboration, as you heard as well. Mayor TG referred to UNDRIP, and I know that the Grand Chief Stuart Phillip of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs has been talking about that as well, in terms of what he would like to see, what change he would like to see to keep UNDRIP in mind, the rights of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, when thinking about reforming, resetting the ministry. What would you like to hear then from the new minister, Grace Lore, to reassure people that there's going to be some deep and systemic change in this ministry?
Well, firstly, your comments with respect to Grand Chief Stuart Phillip. He was one of the people that was on my advisory committee almost 20 years ago.
Okay.
And he had those insights at that point in time, and we were progressing towards that. And unfortunately, that never did come to realization, although I still sit on a board called ISPARC, which is the Indigenous Sports, Parks, and Recreation Council doing that. So I think that the Indigenous ways of doing things, I think we now have a number of First Nations groups that are together. I think there's something like 14 or 50 of them who are wanting to take greater responsibility. I think we should be doing that. I think we should be allowing them to work in their fashion, and they'll have more successes, I think, than we do.
More
So I would
collaboration.
suggest the new minister meet with them.
Okay.
Meet and with those principles.
Certainly was part of the message from Mary TG as well. Gordy Hogue, good to hear from you and hear this context and history. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for taking this on.
You take care. Gordy Hogue is former Minister of Children and Family Development under the Liberals from 2001 to 2004. That's it for BC Today on this afternoon, a Thursday afternoon, and you can listen to the show again on CBC Listen. Use that app, or watch us again on demand on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. We'll continue to follow the weather story, of course, for you throughout the afternoon. In terms of the temperatures, 0 right now in Vancouver, -5 in Nelson, -20 in Prince George. Do join us tomorrow. Brian Minter will be by. We'll talk about caring for our plants in this cold weather. I'm Michelle Eliot. Thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon.